and I'm very pleased that I'm being interviewed by Christian Rodwell on his WealthTalk podcast. It's his second podcast. I've been on your first podcast, haven't I, Christian?
You were on Escape the Rat Race Radio, Rob, yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. So we're talking today about building your wealth through information and intellectual property because Christian and Kevin follow a pillars formula of wealth, and one of their pillars that they teach that they want me to talk about today is information, IP. I have a training business which has done well over the years, and I think that's why Christian wanted to interview me. So we're live on my page. I am your humble guest on your amazing podcast, Christian. I'm all yours.
Rob, welcome to WealthTalk. Great to have you on here today.
My pleasure. I'm excited. I'm all yours.
Yeah, so Rob, we've obviously talked about the WealthBuilders model quickly there, and understanding that wealth is built on multiple pillars, and we have the 7 pillars of wealth model at WealthBuilders. And through the last few months of WealthTalk, we've been moving through in sequential order, talking about how to generate recurring income from your home, from pensions, from property. And we're now just moving out of business and into intellectual property. And if there's one man who understands how to generate wealth in multiple pillars, Rob, I think it's your good self. So it's wonderful. And I'd love to just kind of take a little bit of a step back and look at how you've maybe used multiple pillars, because I know your story well, Rob, and I'll ask you to maybe just share a very little bit, because I'm sure most of our listeners will know you already as well. But I guess the first pillar it all kicked off with for you in terms of wealth building was perhaps the joint venture pillar. Would that be correct?
Yeah. So I tried for a few years, maybe between my late teens and mid-20s, a few different businesses. Really, I was more self-employed to try and, be successful and make some money. Art, pub landlord, architect, and they never really worked out for me. And I think it was because I didn't really understand what a business was. I understood, having a passion or something creative, but I didn't understand how to turn it into a business. And on December the 15th, 2005, my dad had a nervous breakdown in the pub that I was working in. I worked in my dad's pub. I was very reliant on my family for money, and I got myself kind of into a fair bit of debt, financially and kind of emotionally lost, directionless. And then when my dad had his nervous breakdown, this was in front of all the customers in his pub, I had this moment of shame but also clarity, in that I felt very embarrassed and a huge amount of guilt that my dad had raised me to be an entrepreneur, but I'd never really done anything with it. And I'd never been independent. And I'd always relied on safer options, like, going through the conventional school and uni system, or working in my mum and dad's pub because it was safe and easy and comfortable. And I guess I'd built up this fear of taking any risk, of doing something different. But I knew that my life, I was only 25, 26 when I got this realization, and some people are 46 and 66 when they get this. So I was very grateful I got it quite early in my life. But in that moment, after my dad's nervous breakdown, got sectioned, got put in the mental institutional part of the hospital for a long time, I really strongly reevaluated, through a lot of emotional pain, what I wanted to do with my life. And I didn't know what it was at all, Christian. I had no idea. And a lot of people are looking to get perfect before they start. Well, I had no idea. But because I had this huge pain driver, I just put myself out there and started exploring and listening to people for a change. And one of the things that was a bit serendipitous, which led to my joint venture, Christian, was that an art gallery in Peterborough, which was one of the few places where my art was exhibited that actually sold any of my work. The gallery owner was sort of a little bit of I didn't know what mentors were back then, but he'd become a bit of a mentor. He was he's in his 50s, a bit more life experience than me, and he was just giving me some support and guidance. And he kept saying to me, Rob, you need to get into property, you need to get into property, you need to get into property. And of course I was like, I'm skint, I'm an artist, I don't like rich people, I listen to Rage Against the Machine, I'm a fuck the system kind of guy, and I just dismissed it all. And then that next week, after the December the 15th, when I'd had my kind of really rude awakening, if you like, I said to Mike, tell me about these property events I'm in. And he told me about one of them. It was a local one in Peterborough in the Holiday Inn, and I went. And at the end of that meeting, I met Mark Homer, who is my, still to this day, JV partner. In fact, we're going down to London today to see our accountant together. And we've bought hundreds of properties together. And we've built Progressive, you know, the UK's largest property training business together. So that is one big joint venture. It's a joint venture of property portfolio where we own, co-own and manage our hundreds of properties together. It's a joint venture in the companies, the training companies, Progressive Property, Progressive Success, which do 8 figures a year in revenue. It's a joint venture in all the books that we've written, because we've written lots of books between us. And so property and joint ventures, and then leading into training and information, probably been the 3 most successful wealth building strategies for me. And that's how we get here to this day.
Yeah. So our focus today, Rob, is obviously on the business and the IP pillar in particular. So I was doing a little bit of research, trying to go back to the first book, and was that 2008 or was there anything before that?
No, you're right. It was 2008 when we launched Property Investing Secrets, or it had a different name back then. And that was my first move into information or intellectual property. And we launched that book and it did surprisingly well. We self-published. I had no idea how to do it, but again, I'm pretty good at starting now and getting perfect later. And then when that book did quite well, we actually did a couple of joint ventures. I remember a chap called Chris Howard who had a big events training business back then. And I agreed to do a little bit of promotion for his company and do some testimonials on his stage because his courses have been really good for me. And in return, he sent an email out to his database offering our book, and we sold thousands. And it was like, wow. And that really kick-started us. So that was another joint venture, Christian. But yeah, after that happened, that book went out and we sold thousands, and I expected to sell tens of copies, not thousands. And we had all this demand. And so we did our very first property investing masterclass in 2008 off the back of the book. And then we built a mentoring and masterminding off the back of the course. And of course, now we do 850 training days a year. And myself, Mark, and our trainers have written dozens of books. So it's just grown since then.
Now, I know you're mentoring a lot of people, Rob. Who do you recommend, or when would you recommend someone look at creating some intellectual property around their personal brand or around their business, or even if they're working, perhaps they can still create some IP inside a job as well. So to help people start thinking about the first steps of generating income from intellectual property.
Yeah, so this is a good question, and I think the answer is balanced. And I just want to make this known up front. There are a few people out there that are teaching stuff that they've been doing for not very long and haven't got that much experience in it. And maybe therefore their advice is not that sound, or they have to overinflate what it is that they do because they know that information and training-based revenue is a good business model. On the other side of it, we all have to start somewhere. And if you don't start and you wait until you've got 30 years experience in your industry before you have a training model or mastermind or a mentorship or a consultancy, well, how are you ever going to build a business? So I believe the balance is somewhere in the middle. So why don't you start with something that you're already experienced in? Now, it might not be what you want to move into, but you might have 10 or 20 years in corporate experience. You may be brilliant at something that you've done as a passion for 20 years and never really thought about monetizing it in any way. But I think it's always wise to start with experience you've already got. And I'm working with someone at the moment who is a very, very, very successful ice skater. And she's looking at doing leadership training. And I said, well, you bring in all the experience of decades of seriously high-level competition ice skating and try and make something quite unique. Because look, let's use leadership as the example. There's such demand for leadership training. And there's a lot of leadership training. And there are people who've been genuine leaders for 30 or 40 years. But you can have leadership in many different areas. It could be in sports. it could be in corporate, it could be in mindset and personal development, it could be in the army. I was talking to someone giving them some consultancy who's 4 weeks away from leaving the army, and he's looking at building an information business to help people transition out of the army and use his leadership skills from the army. And I think that that's really smart. And he can use all their experience to create a product and a service that leverages that experience, but also maybe create something a bit new. Now, if you're going into something completely new, then you want to build some experience first. So just to make this really clear, Christian, I did not start teaching property until Mark and I had bought well over 50. And there are some people that are teaching property who've bought well under 5. And again, I'm not a critic, and I'm not going to say to people that you should not start. But if you've got under 5 properties, your training should be how to buy your first buy-to-let. Now that actually would be a good training course for people who want to buy their first buy-to-let. Because sometimes people who've got 100 buy-to-lets, someone who wants to buy one, that's a bit scary or a bit too far ahead. I mean, Progressive have trained many of the other trainers in the property training business, yet people go to them, not us, and they've got a lot less experience. But I think they do that because they've got less experience. So you only have to have the experience above, and it doesn't have to be 10 levels above, 1 or 2 levels above the people that you're teaching. But just be clear about who you're teaching and what your niche is. If you've got 5 buy-to-lets, teach people how to get their first buy-to-let, how to transition from relying on a pension to starting your property portfolio, or have a training business or a book called Start Your Property Portfolio. If you've got 100 properties, it's build a 100 property portfolio. If you've got an empire, it's called How to Build an Empire. And there's a space for all of us, as long as we leverage our previous experience, we create our ideal niche, we don't over or under inflate what we can do. We start now and then we develop as we go.
And you referred to the word leverage there, Rob. And of course, when it comes to wealth, you have to use leverage. And intellectual leverage, as you just said there, is a great place for someone to begin. Talk about life leverage, Rob, because that, I know, was another very successful book of yours. What are some of the concepts in there that would be useful for someone listening to Wealth Talk to understand about leverage?
Okay, so leverage is about getting more done in less of your own personal time. It's about outsourcing the tasks and the roles that you don't enjoy, or you're not good at, or cause you stress, or bottleneck you from really growing and doing what you should be doing for your organization of one or many. It's about leading rather than doing. It's about vision and strategy rather than tasks and to-do lists. It's about building a team, whether it's outsourced or insourced. It's about thinking, who can I get to do this who's better than me, instead of how do I get this done? It's about not getting to capacity personally where you get overwhelmed, overworked, stressed. It's about creating scale without relying on you for the hustle and the grind. So it's about letting go to grow. They would be the core concepts of the book, because I think many of us who are of my generation, I'm 41, and my dad's generation, who's 75, especially my dad's generation, it's like hard work equals success. But in the modern day world, there are kids in their teens and early 20s who've got YouTube channels that generate 10, 15, 20 million a year. There's kids of 8 years old who's got that. There's these people who play computer games. One guy won, it was in the tens of millions for winning, what was that game? I forget the name of it. It's a very famous, begins with F, I think. Fortnite, that's the one. Thanks, Louis, at the back there. And so, you know, there's all these outsourcers and virtual assistants, and there's this software and systems and apps and social media and Facebook groups and WhatsApp and all these things that you could achieve more with less of your own work and grind. And they are the things that life leverage covers. It's also about outsourcing your cooking, your cleaning, You're driving. I've got a driver that takes me around everywhere. And to a lot of people, they think that's an opulent luxury. When in reality, if I pay him 200 quid for a 300-mile round trip, but I get 1,000 quid's worth of work done, and I get there rested and unstressed, that actually has a financial and emotional and time upside benefit. So it's about thinking not just about the cost of something, but the opportunity cost. And it's about preserving time at all costs. They would be some of the concepts.
Absolutely. And we've just done a kind of end of year survey with our members, Rob, and time, it always comes up as a challenge for people. And one of the great ways to leverage your time, of course, is to listen to podcasts. Yes. So you can be learning whilst you're, in the gym or traveling. And I know podcasting is very close to your heart, Rob, and you've built the disruptive entrepreneur brand, and how many downloads? Give us some stats on where you're at with your podcast at the moment now, Rob.
I have millions of downloads as opposed to hundreds of thousands or tens of thousands. We reach 202 countries. I was told by someone in my team, Rob, there are only 180 something countries, but not according to Omni Studio when you look at the stats. So there are clearly some countries that people haven't heard of. Tens of thousands of listens a day. The Disruptive Entrepreneur has been brilliant for my brand. And podcasting for me is, I really enjoy it. So I don't have to think twice about being on your show. Obviously, Christian, I've known you for years. So that makes it nice and easy to decide. Thanks, Harry. It's such great leverage. I mean, you talked about leverage before. But how else could I reach 202 countries without a podcast? Well, I'd have to have a bloody expensive around the world ticket, and I'd have to take 2.5 to 3 years out of my life to go to one country every week to achieve that. Someone even said to me once, Rob, you do all these public speeches, and I've spoken in front of thousands of people at an event, one event, thousands of people. But he said, in one day, your podcast gets more listeners than you could fill a stadium for a public speech. So that's a good point. So there's fantastic leverage for the business owner, the provider of the podcast, but also, like you said, for the listener, because they can do it in the car, on the run, walking, on the train, on the plane. So you can get that net time leverage of dead time becomes productive time.
So we're talking about intellectual property, Rob, and of course generating income. Now, many people who will have a podcast will use it as a promotional purpose, but is there a way that you can help people to understand how they could potentially turn a podcast into a wealth building asset as well? Yeah,
I mean, there's different ways to monetize a podcast, Christian, and that's all based on your vision. So up until probably episode 400, we never ran a single ad because I didn't need the money. And so I didn't want people to think I was doing the podcast for the money, because you listen to some American podcasts, and I'm a big fan of American podcasts, but some of them run 5 ads, or the first episode comes out and they run 3 ads, and it just doesn't quite seem to add up. These are supposed to be the most successful people on the planet. But then, of course, I don't begrudge anyone creating extra income. It's smart. But now we have Blinkist as a sponsor. I always said I probably won't have any ads. And then when I changed my mind, I said, well, if I'm going to have ads, it's going to be something I've got to believe in. Like there's some podcasts that run ads for mattresses, and I'm never going to do that because my podcast is about business. So, we get a lot of money per episode. Like if I give you the stats generically, and this is way above industry standard, Christian, but you can get about £100 1,000 downloads. In fact, you can get £110 per 1,000 downloads. I know, because I've achieved those numbers. That's a lot. I mean, if you get 10,000 downloads, which is not that hard for a podcast, that's £1,100. And you'd probably get that on an episode on a day, even if you're not the biggest podcast in the world. You're just in the lower medium echelon. And of course, you know, over the lifetime, that might get 50,000 downloads and you've earned £5,500 for an episode you did a year ago. So that's one way. Another way is to do the trickle-down revenue effect, Christian, which is to just do good content, and people will naturally Google you and find you on Facebook and find you on Instagram and find you on Amazon and find you on Audible, and they'll find your books and they'll find your Facebook groups and they'll find your seminars and they'll find your products. And this is a fag packet calculation, so don't quote me on it, but I reckon it's more than £3 million, maybe £3.5 million in trickle-down revenue we've accidentally generated from the podcast, The Disruptive Entrepreneur. So that's another way to generate revenue. You can do partnerships with people. You can actually be a guest on other people's podcasts and, you know, get good reach that way. And then they find your podcast and they go and do the trickle-down effect. You could get on Luminary or a paid platform and get revenue that way. You could send people to a Patreon or a Facebook supporters and ask your listeners, hey, look, I don't ever want to run ads because that's not my style. But if you love my work, would you mind joining my supporter program for £3.49? Or would you mind giving me some stars? Or would you mind going to my Patreon and just making a small donation so that we can continue to grow the podcast? And people earn tens or hundreds of thousands of dollars a month just doing that. Now, of course, caveat, Christian, that doesn't happen on episode 1. And, it usually takes time to build a good brand and a good podcast. But if you build a good podcast and you're consistent, that will come. Now, I need to tell you one more thing just to finish this question. The knock-on effects of my podcast have been vast. So I have many celebrities who follow me. I was actually, one of the guys who I mentor is Kevin Clifton, who's on BBC Strictly Come Dancing. He's a massive celebrity. And he found me through my books and podcasts. He's a fan of my podcast. And he was on BBC This Morning talking about how we'd helped him with his podcast and I'm his mentor, which is obviously a great thing. I get recognized everywhere I go for being a podcaster. That's kind of ironic because you can't see my face when you're podcasting. And I, for 10 years, building an 8-figure business, like 10, 15, 20 million a year, give or take, I'd get recognised once a year for being the founder of Progressive Property. But if I'm in Dubai Airport or if I'm Peterborough walking down my local street, I always get pulled up and recognised. And it's always for my podcast. I was at the Liverpool Man U game yesterday, Christian. Get this for the power of a podcast. Because bear in mind, I'm not a celebrity in the conventional sense. So every time I get recognised, it kind of feels good and fun. And I don't have to sit there like I sign the odd book and do the odd selfie, but I don't have to do it for hours like Tom Cruise. I'm just a normal guy who's done a podcast and built a business. But I'm there at the Liverpool game. We're at hospitality, the Liverpool Man U game. And some guy came up to my table. And Bruce Grobbelaar, by the way, he was there as the... Because in hospitality, they have a legend that comes in every game. And it was Bruce Grobbelaar, who I love. I love Bruce Grobbelaar. And the guy comes up to me while we're eating. He says, sorry to interrupt. He goes, you're Rob Moore, aren't you? And I went, yeah. And he goes, I knew it was you. I don't know what you look like, but I could hear you because I listened to your podcast. And he said, look, I'm a massive fan. I love Bruce Grobbelaar, but I'm more interested in meeting you. Blah, blah, blah. I love your work. By the way, I have hospitality tickets all the time. So if you want to give me your number, I'll hook you up with a load of hospitality tickets for the Liverpool games. I'm like, I don't need to earn any money on a podcast. That'll do me.
No, that's brilliant. That's brilliant. You mentioned the Facebook supporters program there, Rob, which I know you had kind of early invite into that program. Just another example there of how intellectual property is just expanding and growing, and the opportunities are just so large now for someone. Yeah. Where perhaps if we look at property, which has had some challenges over recent years, hasn't it, in terms of building wealth, and for someone who is starting right at the beginning, why would you recommend business and IP as a really exciting asset class for people? Well,
look, I love property too. So for me, this is not an either or. This is an and question. And I know it is for you too, Christian. What I love about IP, information, premium content, your life's work that you put into courses, masterminds, mentorships, books, retreats, franchises, systems, manuals. There's apps. There's so many different forms of IP. The reason I love that business model is because personal brand, the concept of the personal brand is huge at the moment. The social media platforms are all reducing the friction continually for you to get out to millions of people for free. They're creating all these new features like Facebook Stars, Patreon, like the Facebook Supporter Program, ways to reward good content providers with money. So we're almost on trend and at the right time in the history of the world to create information. Also, the human beings are busier than ever, are more overwhelmed than ever, and so need education and information to reduce overwhelm. A lot of people don't want a full-time job for the rest of their career anymore. They're looking for their own side hustle or their own business. And what do they need for that? Education, information, mentorship and guidance and support. And you get to express your passion and turn it into a profession. So there's a lot of wins there.
There are. So finally, Rob, is there anything I haven't asked you about the world of business? And well, that's a lot we could talk about business, but in particular, intellectual property, before I let you go for today.
Well, look, we could talk forever, Christian, and I appreciate the interview and the time. So if I could pick one thing, I'd say I'm seeing this as an exciting trend, and that is the phoenix rising of premium content again. So if anyone can remember the 1980s, you look too young for this, Christian, but humour me. But in the 1980s, it was like everyone was a consultant and no one would open their mouth unless you paid them a fee. And if you think of 2017, it was the opposite, where no one could get paid for information and all information was either on Google or Facebook groups or forums or Reddit or Quora or Medium or blogs or you name it. And so the pendulum had completely swung. At 1980s, just pay me. 2017, I've got to put out tons of hours. And Gary Vee is telling me 47 pieces of content a day for years to be a success. And now it's swinging back. Because now there's Facebook Supporter Program, there's Patreons, there's Facebook Stars, which have just launched. I'm one of only 20 people in the world currently to have this feature. You're going to get paid for content now. There's Luminary for podcasts. There's Netflix for, TV and information. There's like, it used to be just Sky and BBC, and now there's all these different, there's Audible. There's so many different premium content providers. There's Blinkist, short bits of summaries of books. And this trend, I believe, is on the rise. And I'm really excited because if you want to put content out there, if you want to turn your passion into your profession, if you want to create IP, and you want to train people and be a mentor or a coach, run courses, create information, you're in the right time, the best time ever to get paid for it. And that would be a trend I would encourage people to hotly pursue if you want to create an information marketing business. And by the way, the information-based business for me is the most fun part. Doing podcasts, writing courses, teaching people, mentoring people, doing public speeches, meeting celebrities. I mean, I get paid for that, and that's like a pinch yourself. I actually get paid for that moment. So that's also an added thing for me. Now, it's not for everyone. So if you're an introvert, you're like, none of this is good for me. Well, that's not true. If you're an introvert, do podcasts, because no one sees your face. So you're all good.
Rob, I've really enjoyed speaking with you as always today. Thanks so much for sharing, obviously, all of your experience and insights for everyone listening. And take care. We'll catch up again soon, I'm sure.